We're very pleased to have Rosalynde Welch. Again, she's well known on the internet, right? So, and you can look at her bio in the program. And so, with no further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Rosalynde.
Disenchanted Mormonism, Practicing a Rooted Religion. Part 1, The Enchanted Forest. 39 years ago, this summer, my parents attended the Utah Shakespeare Festival. They watched a production of As You Like It, Shakespeare's comedy of love and transformation set in the enchanted forest of Arden. Several weeks later, actually, I just learned from my mother this week, it was a year later, my mother gave birth to their first child, a daughter whom they named Rosalynde, after the clever, independent heroine they had met on stage. Shakespeare's Rosalynde and her beloved, Orlando, are the dazzling romantic leads of the play, but if you'll forgive the cliche, the most important character in the story isn't a person at all, but a place, the forest of Arden. The forest is a realm of simplicity, harmony, and above all, enchantment. Early lore about the forest of Arden included enchanted rings and fountains. In Shakespeare's hands, the forest is not so much the realm of spirits as it is the realm of the spiritual. Every experience is more vivid, every word filled with significance and promise, and the felt presence of a kindly intelligence guiding the action. As one character puts it, "And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything." In the forest, every sapling and every stone radiates a spiritual significance. Every perception, every sensation, even a biting winter wind, can be made to yield a deeper meaning if one is attuned to its whisper. These winter winds, the same character says, are counselors that feelingly persuade me what I am. The forest of Arden is an other world, a place of spiritual awakening where one sees beyond the surface of things to discover truer identities and truer relationships. I inherited Rosalynde's name, but I did not inherit her place in the enchanted other world. The world that I perceive most immediately does not shimmer with significance. Unseen messengers do not whisper to me from trees and streams. The world that I inhabit at the most intuitive level is good, but it is not shared with spirits, nor does it intimate a spiritual realm before and beyond. Now, this is not to say that these spirits and these lives are not real. The texts and the prophets that I affirm as holy, not to mention the combined witness of millions, promise that they are. Let me emphasize that. I am not saying that these spiritual lives and beings are not real, only that they are not given to me in my most immediate perceptions. The most basic spiritual experience, a sense of this life as a window to an ineffable order beyond, is not given to me. The veil is thick for this Rosalynde. I titled my remarks Disenchanted Mormonism. This is a bit of wordplay. Alas, probably not worthy of my Shakespearean namesake. I'm not a disenchanted Mormon. On the contrary, I am Mormon to the bone, and I've been shaped by LDS teachings in every particular. Nor am I disenchanted with Mormonism. The relationship to the church and its culture is my anchor. But I am interested in thinking about a disenchanted Mormonism, that is, at a way of living as an engaged Latter-day Saint, even if one lacks a strong spiritual sensibility, as I do. For me and others like me, does the church offer a nourishing home? I'm loosely borrowing the term disenchantment here from the work of the German sociologist Max Weber, who uses the term to describe the process of secularization that seemed, for a time in the 20th century, the inevitable sequel to modernity. But I'm not using disenchantment in this strict sociological sense. In fact, I'm brazenly repurposing the idea to describe something very different, a personal state, a particular way of perceiving the world, and a particular way of interpreting those perceptions. One aim of my talk today is simply to identify and describe this condition that I'm calling disenchantment. I use my own experience as a reference point, not because I assume that you are personally interested in me. I know that you are not, but simply because my own worldview is the one that I know best. My perceptions may not match yours. Indeed, they probably will only resonate with a minority of Latter-day Saints in this room and in the church. Nevertheless, I do hope that my remarks will be relevant to that minority and interesting, if nothing else, to the rest of you. Otherworldly spiritual emotion, flashes of intuitive spiritual knowledge, deeply sensed connections to spirits and their world, conviction that prayers are heard and answered, euphoric moments of confirmation. These have been rare experiences in what has nevertheless been my deeply meaningful path through Mormonism. It's not so much that I don't feel the Spirit, to use our typical LDS phrase. Occasionally, I do experience the chills, the rushing emotion, and the overflow of joy that characterize present-day LDS spirituality. For me, however, these sensations do not self-interpret immediately as manifestations of the Spirit. When I find a lost set of keys, for example, my first thought is, oh, that was really lucky, not, oh, I'm so grateful that Father in Heaven is aware of me. When I'm hiking in the mountains, my perception is, this world is extravagantly beautiful, and I belong here. Not, a loving Heavenly Father created this world for me. When I have held my newborns, my feeling is, there is nothing more precious and exquisite. Not immediately, God gave this child to me. In other words, my immediate perceptions give me a world that is beautiful, that is good, and it is always my home, but they do not give me an everyday life into which an other world, a realm of God's intervening presence, is spiritually infused. Instead, I am sustained by what we might call this worldly religion, religion rooted in what's given to the present, the loving community that I found in my wards and my family, opportunities to serve and to be served, the consecrated ideal of building Zion, the comforting warmth of religious ritual, rooted connection to family and church histories. My most powerful religious experiences have come while singing congregational hymns, no doubt much too slowly, while sitting quietly in a Portuguese hovel with the sister incapacitated by stroke and unable to speak, while watching an amateur theatrical in a cultural hall at a Saturday morning ward Christmas party. You might say, inverting the typical formulation, that I am religious but not spiritual. I'm drawn to the communal structure of religious tradition and practice, but I lack a strong spiritual perception. Now, my intention today is not to justify this particular way of being in the world. I don't know why this has been my experience. I was raised by wonderful parents in an active and loving LDS home. I went to BYU, I served a mission, I married in the temple, and I have served actively, and I'm raising my 4 kids in the church. So I have been enculturated into Mormonism in an entirely typical way. Perhaps it's some combination of my innate temperament, the habits of mind I acquired in higher education, or my life experience that have closed off the perceptual channels through which otherworldly sensations travel. It may be also that I have failed to train my spiritual perception properly. I'm open to that criticism. I attempt to redress this the best that I can by receiving other people's spiritual experiences with all of the respect and the sympathy that I am able to. I am open to the possibility that it is simply that my spiritual capacities have not yet matured, and I live in hope that they will someday do so. In general, though, I don't dwell on these questions of psychology, which I found rarely yield definitive answers. Instead, I concentrate on understanding how it is that I can live now meaningfully in this disenchanted forest. Part 2, spiritual but not religious. It's not obvious at first glance that my way of being makes any sense at all. Spiritual experience has always been the heart of religion. William James, describing his monumental effort to distill the essence of religious experience, wrote that the mother, sea, and fountainhead of all religions lie in the mystical experiences of the individual. We are thus made convincingly aware of the presence of a sphere of life larger and more powerful than our usual consciousness, with which the latter is nevertheless continuous. The impressions and impulsions and emotions and excitements which we thence receive help us to live. They found the invincible assurance of a world beyond the senses. They melt our hearts and communicate significance and value to everything and make us happy. So for James, dogma and moral strictures are at best secondary elements of religion. Its primary and sustaining feature is the personal experiential journey through the enchanted forest, alive with mystical messages, very thinly veiled from the other world of spirits, promising a reality beyond the senses with which we can be ineffably united. James's insight suggests why it is that for early Latter-day Saints, charismatic spiritual manifestations were, such as Pentecostal speaking in tongues, exactly as Lynn opened to us before, which are foreign to our modern sensibilities, were so central to their religious practice. James can help us understand why the eccentric spiritual manifestations described in the Book of Mormon, particularly fainting as if dead, feature so prominently in accounts of Nephite religion and conversion. And through the Jamesian lens, the heart of modern Latter-day Saint experience lies in personal encounter with the Spirit, in spiritual knowledge intuited during meditative study, in the spiritual emotion of a testimony meeting, in the spiritual conviction of an answered prayer, and in the spiritual presence of loving ancestors. But if institutional religion and spiritual experience have always been connected, they have also always been separable. Many of the religious upheavals that have shaped the West's passage into modernity have orbited this question of whether or not spirituality must be housed within an institutional religion. One project of the Reformation, for example, was to move the individual's encounter with God out of the confessional and into the private closet. That is, of the institutional church's exclusive authority and into the emerging authority of the private conscience. Mary Sidney, a 16th century English Protestant, paraphrased lines from Psalm 139, and I'll cut this down. I'll read the whole thing. O Lord, in me there lieth not, but to thy search revealed lies. For when I sit, thou markest it, no less thou notest when I rise. Yea, closest closet of my thought hath open windows to thine eyes. So here Mary Sidney is relocating spiritual encounter from the chapel to the closest closet of thought, as it were. Her psalms record the long ascent of the individual mind as the privileged seat of authentic spirituality, and the long divorce of spirituality and religiosity in Western culture. And that long divorce is ongoing. Last year, the Pew Research Forum made headlines with its findings on the rise in religiously unaffiliated individuals, now reaching just under 20% of all American adults. What is striking about this finding, among other things, is how many of these people, unaffiliated with an organized religion, nevertheless consider themselves to be spiritual seekers. And here's a quote from their report. Many of the country's 46 million unaffiliated adults are religious or spiritual in some way. 2/3 of them say they believe in God. More than half say they often feel a deep connection with nature and the earth, while more than 1/3 classify themselves as spiritual but not religious. And 1 in 5 say they pray every day. So these spiritual but not religious seekers are following to its logical end, the path marked by Mary Sidney and others. Institutional religion is now understood to be not only insufficient for authentic spiritual encounter, but unnecessary. Wandering in forests is often best done alone, after all. If James was right, and religious dogma and authority have always been secondary features of religious experience, then perhaps these unaffiliateds have not, in fact, abandoned religion, but have merely stripped it down to its purest psychological form. This movement away from organized religion hasn't been all bad. The Restoration itself began at a way station along this path. If young Joseph had not believed that the authority to adjudicate dogma and reject clerical authority was legitimately his own, he may never have made his way into the enchanted hardwood forest that Latter-day Saints know as the Sacred Grove. Joseph's first vision embodies the Jamesian notion that the fountainhead of all religions lie in the mystical experiences of the individual. Joseph himself, it turns out, was, for a time, spiritual but not religious. All this has been to concede that the path out of religion and into an individualistic spirituality is, in fact, a well-worn highway with its own logic, its own utility, and thus to set up my primary question, which is, what sense can we make of a U-turn on this highway? What can we make of the religious but not spiritual? What of a congregant like me who, for whatever reason, has limited access to personal spirituality? Are the dogma, the hierarchy, the pageantry, the communal morality of religion enough to create meaningful experience without recourse to intense spiritual perception? This question is especially acute for Latter-day Saints. As Lynn showed us, one cannot understand the Restoration without grasping the intensity of Joseph's exchange with the world of spirits, what Terrell Gibbons has called dialogic revelation. Joseph drew back the curtains of consciousness that flank birth and death to reveal spirit worlds in the very image of our own. The conviction that our lives and relationships will survive death through the atonement of Christ, will persist intact in other worlds, forms the core of his invincible assurance of a world beyond the senses. So then, how is a Latter-day Saint with limited access to these spiritual dimensions to find meaning in our deeply spiritualistic practices and teachings? Now notice that I don't frame the question as why. Why would such a Latter-day Saint choose to stay, for instance? A number of answers to that particular question immediately spring to mind. Most of them are fairly quotidian. She might stay to preserve family relationships or status in the community. She might enjoy the practical benefits of a close-knit community. She might stay out of sentimental affection for or a deep identification with Mormon culture. She might stay on the basis of hope in or respect for Restoration teachings or scripture or history. I certainly stay for all of these reasons, but ultimately I choose not to dwell on this kind of reason-seeking. I'm skeptical of my ability to retrieve my true motivations from deep psychological recesses. I'm not even sure what a true motivation is. I simply know that I belong to the Restoration. It claims me as its child. I am a member of the church in the thickest sense of membership, in the sense that the novelist Wendell Berry uses that word. For Berry, membership in a community is not a lifestyle choice or even a deliberately assumed identity. It is not a choice at all. It is a given. One of his characters says, "The way we are members of each other, all of us, everything. The difference ain't in who is a member and who is not, but who knows it and who don't." I am a member, and I do know it. The live question for me, then, is not why stay, but how. So let me offer one more caveat before I tackle the question itself. I'm asking the how question, but I am not intending to offer here a how-to. I don't consider myself a guru or a guide. I offer these thoughts as nothing more than my own personal ruminations. I will be pleased if they stimulate reflection and discussion, but I do not intend them to be a practical faith rescue program, and you'll see why. Practicality has never been my strong suit. Part 3, the new paradigm of doubt. So one way to interpret my condition of disenchantment would be as an extended episode of doubt. The world of spirit is not often open to me, so I might conclude that it doesn't exist at all. Perhaps I've built my life on an illusion. I'm teaching my children fairy tales. One by one, the dominoes fall. Doubt, under this paradigm, is the remainder of a fractured certainty, and that fracture is experienced as an emotional, epistemological, and existential crisis. As doubt, the disenchanted forest gives way to Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach, the scene of perplexity and alienation that remains when faith recedes like a tide. And here is an excerpt from that poem. The sea of faith was once, too, at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. This is a bleak place to be sure. There is always pain in crisis, especially crisis of faith. Yet, there has probably never been a better time than the present to be a doubting Mormon. Doubt seems to be having a bit of a Mormon moment. In conference, in firesides, in blogs, in the New York Times recently. Whereas expressions of spiritual uncertainty in official LDS discourse have been uncommon, we've recently seen a lifting of that taboo. Elder Holland, in this past General Conference, gave permission to be as candid about your questions as you need to be. Life is full of them on one subject or another. Elder Holland's address stops short of fully accepting doubt as an element of discipleship, but it nevertheless does mark a shift in tone, I think. This shift responds to a larger current in LDS culture toward what we might call a redemptive model of doubt. Reacting to the electronic dissemination of controversial church history and anti-Mormon treatments of such, as well as to the wider anti-religion project of the New Atheism, drawing implicitly on the Christian existentialism of Kierkegaard and his disciples, developed among LDS thinkers in the Mormon tradition of personal essay and recently in countless blog posts, this redemptive model of doubt finds its most articulate expositor in Terrell Givens. Givens frames uncertainty as a form of epistemological freedom and faith as the redemptive choice to believe in the face of this uncertainty. Thus, doubt becomes the midwife of a morally significant, because freely chosen faith. And here is his classic formulation. I am convinced that there must be grounds for doubt as well as belief in order to render the choice more truly a choice, and therefore the more deliberate and laden with personal vulnerability and investment. One is, it would seem, always provided with sufficient materials out of which to fashion a life of credible conviction or dismissive denial. We are acted upon, in other words, by appeals to our personal values, our yearnings, our fears, our appetites, and our egos. What we choose to embrace, to be responsive to, is the purest reflection of who we are and what we love. That is why faith, the choice to believe, is, in the final analysis, an action that is positively laden with moral significance. So in this, we can see a three-part paradigm at work. First, doubt reaches a crisis point in which certainty dissolves. Next, the doubter finds herself in a state of radical freedom, suspended between equally justifiable states of belief or denial. And finally, she chooses belief on the basis of a will informed by her deepest personal nature. This is an extremely powerful formulation. Crisis, freedom, and choice are accessible and empowering concepts for the modern believer, and Givens is to be praised and thanked for neutralizing the shame surrounding his proximate or provisional doubt. It must be noted that while he does not spell it out fully, the logic of his argument seems to require that ultimate doubt, that is, doubt that never resolves into freely chosen belief, can only be understood as sin. Nevertheless, I find Givens' new paradigm of doubt to be elegant, compassionate, and energizing, an important addition to LDS thought. Not that he was waiting in any way for my endorsement. Yet, Givens' paradigm has never seemed to fit my personal experience. For one thing, I am just not prone to crisis, whether spiritual or emotional or any other kind. My sojourn in the disenchanted forest, when considered by my own lights and on the basis of my own instincts, has never felt like a crisis. I have rarely felt suspended or stranded on the knife edge between belief or denial. Instead of feeling torn between these binary possibilities, I have simply felt that I was given a different kind of world. The language of faith crisis or faith transition can offer an appealing structure to the experience of uncertainty, but that framework, I've always sensed, is external to my own proper experience. Now, the encounter with uncertainty is infinitely complex, and we should really resist, I think, the impulse to triage and label different kinds of doubters. I know that there are many saints, no doubt many in this room, who experience genuine rupture and transformation in their faith, and for them, the faith crisis paradigm really is a lifeline. But I also suspect that there are others like me for whom this paradigm doesn't really fit, but who nevertheless begin to interpret our experience in terms of crisis simply because that is the available language. The language of faith crisis thus overdetermines the experience of uncertainty, to borrow a term from critical theory. The crisis is prompted partly by an authentic personal turmoil, yes, but also by the available rhetorical frame and by the circulation of that frame in personal narrative. Ironically, the crisis formulation, in casting uncertainty as an acute episode to be resolved rather than a long-term state in which to live, may best serve the perspective of those who have already found certainty in or out of the church and who naturally want others to cast their lot with them. Furthermore, freedom and choice, the second two elements of that trio, which are central to the new paradigm of redemptive doubt, do not strike me as inherently privileged categories. That is to say, the freely or mostly free choosing self seems to be not the ultimate end to be sought, but rather a necessary means to a much greater and more difficult end, and that is awareness of our own limitation, our own obligation, our own dependence and incompleteness, what King Benjamin called our nothingness. Mormon scripture offers at least two accounts of personhood, one emphasizing the sufficiency of our eternal natures as autonomous, choosing co-intelligences with God. The other emphasizing our eternal involvement with and obligation to one another, the insufficiency of the individual choosing self. It is this latter account that grips me personally. Perhaps it is for this reason that the notion of a chosen belief, a belief that we embrace as an affirmation of our deepest self, doesn't resonate with my experience. I have not found myself able to choose to believe that something is or is not true. The ideas and the people that have most deeply shaped me as a person, my family and my religion, were not chosen. They were bequeathed to me first as accidents of circumstance and nature, but over time they have captured me at a level beyond conscious choice. I resonate to John Donne, minus a little of the melodrama, in his most famous holy sonnet. I, like an usurped town to another due, labor to admit you, but owe to no end. Reason your viceroy and me should defend, but is captived and proves weak or untrue. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free. Part 4, puzzle, attend, observe. For a sojourner in the Disenchanted forest, then, what language might better serve the experience than the trio of doubt, freedom, and choice? It would be difficult to match the elegance and accessibility of that formulation, and I freely admit that I will fail to do that here today. Nevertheless, I'll propose in conclusion here an alternative sequence of key words that I hope will begin to describe another route through a disenchanted Mormonism. As I have said, my experience has not been one of conventional religious doubt. I've never identified with the doubt model or thought of myself as a doubter in that way, an agonizing knife edge demanding resolution through insight or decision. Instead, after searching the thesaurus for the right word, I have felt that my state is one of puzzlement. Puzzlement is a gentler and more sustainable state of mind than crisis. It entails patience, an internal stillness, and an acknowledgement of my own failure to wring answers from an inscrutable world. Puzzlement implies humility. If provisional doubt must be mastered by individual judgment and choice, then puzzlement, on the other hand, marks the limits of our intellectual and moral mastery. Moreover, the notion of puzzlement instead of doubt allows us to uncouple belief from faith and faith from choice in that troubling but inescapable logic of doubt. Puzzlement allows us to think about faith not as a moral victory over uncertainty, but rather as an encounter with uncertainty itself, which is to say, an encounter with the limits of our own capacity to comprehend and control the world. When we encounter church doctrines or practices that we fail to understand or we can't justify, or when we taste suffering in our own lives and the lives of those we love, we find ourselves puzzled by God's will. These moments of hesitation become the personal occasions of faith. They originate not in our capacity to choose, in our strength of will, but on the contrary, in our own limitation of mind, in our insufficiency to comprehend, or our present inability to decide. Faith begins at the moment we say, I don't understand. Faith here is not a choice to believe, but choices opposite, born in a moment of spiritual hesitation, not first a triumph of the moral mind, but its fortunate failure. Puzzlement primes us not to know or decide or choose, but simply to attend to experience as it comes. We attend not merely in the sense of showing up as an attending sacrament meeting week after week, especially the boring ones, though that is a necessary precondition for real attention. I mean attend in all of its senses at once, to accompany, to care for, to serve, to pay attention, to notice. Puzzlement leaves us not in a state of heightened freedom, but in a state of heightened attention. The stones in the disenchanted forest may be only stones, no sermons attached, but stones themselves richly repay our focused attention. Whether or not one experiences Latter-day Saint practice as suffused with spiritual presence, one can make oneself fully present in the practice. From this state of quiet attention to what is given, one is prepared to observe. To observe a religious practice is first simply to see it, to hold it in sustained view. Beyond that, to observe a practice is to adopt it or to adhere to it, as in an observant Mormon or an observant Jew. But what value lies in religious observancy without an undergirding spiritual meaning? Some religious practices are inherently rewarding. Celebrating holidays or meditating, for example, those have inherent value apart from any spiritual meaning. But some rules, without an infused spiritual meaning, can feel arbitrary and limiting. If, for example, I find fasting to be a physically taxing practice without discernible spiritual rewards, why then would I ever choose to observe fast Sundays with my congregation? This might appear to be the end of the road for the religious but not spiritual. Without the conviction that spiritual rewards will follow the difficult or arbitrary aspects of religious observance, religion could become nothing more than a collection of folkways to be sorted through on a hunt for just the good ones. But I'm convinced that, on the contrary, one gift of religion to the disenchanted lies precisely in observing unchosen rules. And here's why. For otherworldly souls, those who are frequently gifted with intense spiritual experience, these moments dissolve the conscious, separate self, and they reveal the connected structure of creation. You feel that your own self and your own judgment recedes for a moment as you're overwhelmed with this euphoric emotion that comes from outside. For those of us to whom that experience is not often given, obedience can work in the same way, to momentarily free us from the demands of the self. When I observe a religious practice like fasting, I temporarily dethrone that sovereign self, the self that would move from moment to moment merely on whim or appetite or preference. In turn, the knowledge that I am sharing the experience of fasting, for example, with my covenant tribe gives me a feeling of commonality, of connectedness, of embeddedness. That connected structure of creation is, for me, momentarily laid bare. Rules that limit choice, even when the choices that they limit are otherwise morally neutral, tame the ego. They force us to accept experience as it comes to us rather than as we wish it were. Observing rules merely for the sake of observation itself is a valuable ascetic practice. This kind of whole soul attention-giving is at once a basic and also an utterly unnatural human capacity. Prone to wander, the spirit wants to leap backward into regret or forward into fantasy or desire. To observe is to hold the soul in the now, to train our thoughts and actions on the social forms unfolding before us in time. Religious practice and its secular cousin, the folk way, offer us the forms to hold in our view. Part 5, the road to Emmaus. To conclude, I want to turn for a moment to the New Testament. We moderns find in the New Testament two narratives for dealing with religious doubt. One is the Apostle Thomas, who to modern readers seems to seek an empirical basis for belief and in its absence succumbs to doubt. The other is the frantic father of an ailing child who acknowledges his failure of faith, even as he desperately confesses his desire to believe, saying, "Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief." Both of these stories move me, but there's a third New Testament narrative that captures my experience more fully. It is the story of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. It's not the big reveal at the end that thrills me, the re-enchantment they experience when their spiritual perception is awakened and they reinterpret their past experiences from a new perspective. They say, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us by the way?" I try to maintain a mind and heart open to this kind of re-enchantment, and I live in the hope that it will someday happen, will someday be given to me. But for now, I live on the road to Emmaus, and it is a good place to walk. The two disciples, confronted with unreconcilable realities, that Jesus is the Redeemer of Israel and that Jesus is dead, find themselves at the end of their own ability to know. Denied for a time the spiritual sensibility that transcends apparent contradictions, they instead simply observe the here and now without leaping ahead to ultimate otherworldly answers. They attend to one another and to the ordinary man walking in the road with them, who shares with them extraordinary perspectives. They converse, they commune, they reason together. The momentary absence of the spiritual world seems to root them more firmly in the relationships given to them in the present moment. Abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent. Thank you very much. What time is it? I don't have a watch.
We're good.
Okay. All right. Great.
There's another one. Just so you know.
Thank you. Okay. In view of your current spirituality context, what is your approach to confirming the correct nature of decisions of life direction or other difficult challenges? Yeah, this is a really good question. We're taught as young Mormon children to always make decisions with the direction of the Spirit. And so if one rarely receives that direction, how is one to proceed in life? For me, there's a similar process of prayer, of meditation, of seeking, of pondering, and ultimately, the best that I can describe it is that a way seems to open itself to me. It doesn't suggest itself immediately to me as the Spirit telling me what to do. Now, perhaps it is, and perhaps one day my perceptions will be awakened, and I will know that. But for now, I proceed probably as most of you do. Only the immediate perceptions themselves come in a much more quiet way. I often proceed with a fair amount of uncertainty, and I've been incredibly blessed in my life that I haven't made more mistakes, I guess. Yeah. Oh dear. Sorry, I'll answer that one next. Okay. In your experience, don't we all have at least occasional spiritual experiences, but a mortal tendency to forget our experiences and feelings over time brings doubt, hence the regular charge to always remember him? Yeah, this is a really good point, and it's often suggested, right, that we need to turn our minds back. Can you remember when you felt to sing the song of redeeming love? I think that there's great value in remembering past experiences, attempting to reinterpret them from a new perspective, and to use that as sustenance in our present-day life when, for whatever reason, the spiritual well has run dry. My only concern is when our attention is directed for too long to the past or to the future. I think that when we do that, we find ourselves less open to what is happening in the present right before us because we're not paying as much attention to experience as it comes. Instead, we're tempted to impose some external point of view on what's happening rather than to keep ourselves entirely open. So I think that remembrance that is exquisitely attuned to the present moment now, rather than a kind of dwelling on the past or leaping back always into remembrance or regret, has for me been the most valuable kind of meditative practice in that sense. Okay, this is a question from my friend Dave Bannock. And Dave, I can tell you I'm not going to have a good answer. He writes on the internet, how does your disenchanted Mormonism compare with the tragic worldview that Walter Kaufman, reading through an existential lens, attributed to Shakespeare? Is redemptive doubt an updated version of Shakespearean doubt? That's a great question. I think Dave should write a paper on exactly that notion.
Great answer.
Yeah. I don't think that Shakespeare had access to the sort of ideological context that we have now. So I don't think that Shakespeare dealt with doubt and belief in the same way that we did now. I don't think he could have, because he lived before the rise of empiricism, and that really changes the equation for any modern-day believers. However, Shakespeare's genius is that he is able to find the resonant symbols and the resonant words that seem to make themselves perpetually relevant to the present-day experience. So that is why I continue to turn back to Shakespeare. Not to mention that was what my advanced degree was in, so that helps too. Could a member in the mode of patient puzzlement and stillness in a bewildering world be a missionary and testify of the gospel? And isn't your religion without spirituality just a postmodern formulation of the old cultural Mormon position? Where I would see myself as different from a cultural Mormon is that I do not feel myself free to accept or to deny various aspects of Mormon observance. Now, of course, I'm not the perfect ideal Mormon. None of us are, and I don't observe perfectly in every aspect. But I feel myself bound by covenant that I have made to observe the gospel as fully as I can. And I don't do so simply out of sentimentality or affection or to preserve family relationships. Those are simply there. But as I try to express in the talk, for me, the value of religious observance goes much deeper than that. It's sort of a basic mode of relating to the world that allows me to tame the self and tame the ego. That, for me at least, would like to reign rampant and would like to determine every aspect of my experience. Religious observance, for me, is a crucial practice of restraining and focusing on what's in the here and now. And after the missionary question, I have a sister who just entered the MTC on Wednesday. Yes, I think it would be hard to bear testimony. It's difficult for me to bear testimony in the typical way. It's one thing to stand here before you. It would be another thing to go up in a testimony meeting and try to bear testimony of the things that I've said. So yes, it really would be. I think there's something about my way of being in the church that it does make something like testimony and witnessing more difficult. That's something that I experience personally. And I'm glad that other people have other spiritual gifts and are able to fulfill that role within the church, because it's not given to me. This one is also about missionary service, so more or less the same. Okay, there are so many. On these longer ones, I think I'll keep them. Maybe I'll respond to them on my blog. Given your tenuous or slight spiritual tie to the church, what constitutes and nurtures your behavioral connection to the church and gospel norms? Good question. As I tried to express, for me, it is simply given to me. It is a basic element of my identity. I am a Latter-day Saint. On Sunday mornings, it doesn't feel right to be anywhere except in the pews there. For me, it's not a question of whether or not I choose to be a Mormon. I simply don't experience it that way. I am a Mormon. That is how I was made. I am a Latter-day Saint. So in a lot of ways, that feels to me a stronger basis than than a choice to observe or a choice not to observe. It is simply given to me. It's a basic element of my identity, and I have no reason or desire to fight that or to cut that tie. What are your expectations and purposes for prayer? This is a really good question, and prayer is something that I've struggled with a bit. I love family prayers. It's the central ritual of our family in the evenings. It's the centerpiece of bedtime for my kids. I love that feeling of togetherness. But very obviously, that's something different from a spiritual communion with God, and that has not been an easy thing for me to achieve. I do still pray. I love the Bible dictionary entry on prayer, which talks about prayer as an exercise in submitting our own will to the will of God. So I pray as an exercise in sort of meditation, in calming the thoughts and the whirling anxieties of the day, and in trying to reach that internal stillness and calm as I commune. So I do find prayer to be a valuable religious practice for myself, but yes, it is true that it's been more difficult to sustain. It's a challenge for me. Time for two more? Okay.
Maybe one more.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Here's somebody who just simply affirms my experiences and says that they recognize those, so thank you very much. Another one on personal revelation and big decisions. I have kind of addressed that. Okay, finally, being an individual with limited access to spirituality, what are your convictions concerning the reality of God, the divinity of Christ in the Book of Mormon? How did you arrive to your opinions or conclusions? It's a great question. And sometimes when I am coming up to my Temple Recommend interview, there's a moment where I think, how am I going to answer those questions? Mostly, I don't frame it in terms of beliefs or opinions or conclusions. I frame it in terms of faithfulness and affirmation. I can affirm with my whole soul that I accept the prophets and the scriptures as holy. They witness of these things, and on the basis of trust in that, I can also witness on that. I live faithfully to my covenants. So for me, faith is related to relationships and a faithful relationship to my covenants rather than belief. Do I believe these things? I wouldn't know how to answer that question. Do I believe or not? To me, belief is not the central part of faith. I try to pay attention to the world as it comes to me and live as faithfully to that as I can. And in the meantime, I affirm the covenants that I have made. And that's how I cope with that question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.